The Paris climate change meeting concluded with an historic agreement. For the first time, we saw the international community come together with a level of ambition that looked out for the interests and needs of the world's most vulnerable, those who are really on the front lines of climate change. The real work now, though, needs to start to happen. So once the celebrating is done, the question is, how do you meet the ambition of Paris? As you likely know, one of the things that came out of Paris was this more ambitious target of trying to limit warming to no more than 1.5 degrees Celsius above pre-industrial averages. Now, that's something that comes straight out of mainstream science. That's what we need to be aiming for, but it's a difficult thing to do. How do we get there? Well, the most obvious thing that needs to happen, and the thing that most folks are talking about, is complete decarbonization of the global energy system. We need to move away from fossil fuels. And for the first time, we've reached a moment where that's something that can actually be imagined. With all of the recent gains around solar and wind, moving away from fossil fuels is something that can actually be done. The question for the 1.5 degree target is, though, can it be done quickly enough? Because the mainstream science of climate change tells us that if we want to limit to 1.5 degrees of warming just through decarbonization, then we need to move completely away from fossil fuels within the next handful of decades. It's an extraordinarily difficult, though important thing to do. So given that it's hard to do quickly enough, then there are some folks who are thinking about what are some other tools that you might bring to the table to augment the need to decarbonize, because this is an important point. Decarbonization is the first and primary goal. There's no moving away from that. But what else might be on the table? The challenge here is that if you start thinking about other augmentations, other tools, then that leads us into a conversation about certain things that to this point have been widely seen as unpalatable. I'm thinking about so-called climate engineering technologies in particular. So things like trying to come up with schemes to remove large amounts of carbon from the atmosphere and hold it in storage, or to reflect incoming solar radiation back into space before it can warm planetary systems. So that's what the point of this little piece is. Should we be talking about these sorts of options, and how do we start to have a conversation if we need to? I'd like to make just 3 observations. The first observation is this. The target that was set in Paris is already assuming the use of so-called carbon dioxide removal schemes. And here's what I mean by that. The most recent Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change report, it gave a number of different pathways to try and keep the world beneath a higher threshold of 2 degrees of warming. And almost all of the models that the scientists engaged with that effort could see required the use of so-called negative emissions or carbon dioxide removal schemes. So the models and the science that the negotiators in Paris were using to come up with their threshold is already assuming technologies that we just don't want to consider or talk about. And that's an interesting thing to have to call out. The second related observation is this. There's a real reluctance to talk about climate engineering. And there's good reason for that, because there's lots of concern that any talk that is not focused on decarbonization is going to lead us in the wrong direction. It's a distraction from the real work that needs to happen. And at a moment where the polluters still have the upper hand, to talk about carbon dioxide removal or solar radiation management looks like it's just giving up the ghost. It's moving away from the real work that needs to take place. There's also a danger of so-called technological lock-in. So if you start to privilege a conversation about solar radiation management or carbon dioxide removal, we might get to a moment where those sorts of ideas are brought into the world, even if it turns out that it's a bad idea to use them. So we have to keep those considerations in mind, but this leads to the third observation. Even with those considerations and concerns, my own sense now is that we've reached a moment where those concerns are outweighed by the need for a more honest and robust conversation about the tools available to us. And I say this because as we come out of Paris, there's a real danger that the gap between what was promised by the international community and what is actually delivered starts to grow. And a growth of that gap may lead to widespread disillusionment amongst those of us working on climate change and more generally about our ability to come together to tackle climate change. If you start to see widespread disillusionment, then that's the sort of thing that can encourage the rush to the most outlandish of the possible options. So better to talk about them, I think, ahead of time. The second related point is that the conversation about climate engineering is going on whether folks want it to or not. It's already taking place in scientific communities. It's already happening to a certain extent behind closed doors and policy circles. At the moment, the conversation's largely out of the reach and beyond the scrutiny of the public and civil society actors. I think it's better to bring it out into the open. The post-Paris moment calls for ambition. but it also calls for an honest assessment of the options that we have on the table. Now, an honest assessment of what's going on, the sorts of options that we have, the tools that are available to us, is going to lead to a lot of disagreement and contention, and that's a hard thing. But we can't shy away from that conversation, certainly not now. This is too important. Much better that we proceed from a position of knowing where things stand than proceeding from a position of ignorance.